August 19, 1942, 5:23 a.m., the main beach at Dieppe, France. The men of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry are leaping from their landing craft into a wall of German machine gun fire. Their new secret weapon Churchill tanks, which were supposed to smash the defenses, are bogged down, trapped on a beach made of baseball-sized pebbles called chert. The tanks' tracks spin but cannot grip. They are static, smoking coffins. The men are pinned. The seawall they were meant to storm is 12 feet high and laced with wire. Behind it, German troops in fortified hotels and cliffside bunkers pour fire down into a perfectly designed killing box. By 9 a.m., the raid is a failure. By 11 a.m., it is a slaughter. Now look at this. June 6, 1944. 2 years later. The Allies are storming the open beaches of Normandy. They have specialized tanks to clear mines, to lay bridges, to lay their own roads. They are not attacking a port. They are bringing their own port with them. Everything you see here, this overwhelming, meticulously planned success, was made possible by the absolute catastrophic failure you just witnessed. The Dieppe raid was not a battle. It was a lesson. A brutal, fatal rehearsal for D-Day, paid for almost entirely in Canadian blood. To understand why 6,000 men were sent to their deaths at Dieppe, you have to understand the map of 1942. Britain stood alone, saved by the Channel, but on the continent, Hitler was winning. His armies were deep inside Russia, driving towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. The Soviet Union was bleeding. Joseph Stalin was sending desperate, furious telegrams to Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt. His message was simple: open a second front, now. The political pressure was immense. The Americans, newly in the war and full of confidence, agreed with Stalin. They wanted a full-scale invasion of France, and they wanted it in 1942. Churchill was horrified. He had seen the beaches of Dunkirk. He knew the German army was a buzzsaw. He believed an invasion in 1942 would be a disaster that could lose the entire war. But the Allies had to do something. They had to relieve pressure on the Russians. They had to test the German defenses, what Hitler called the Atlantic Wall. And the Americans had to be shown just how hard this would be. A compromise was born, not a full invasion, but a raid in force, a temporary seizure of a German-held port. The man chosen to lead this new aggressive strategy was Lord Louis Mountbatten, the head of combined operations. The target selected was the port town of Dieppe. On paper, it was perfect. It was within range of RAF fighter cover from England. The port was large enough to be a credible target, but small enough to be raided. The objectives were ambitious. First, land on 6 beaches simultaneously. The main force, the 2nd Canadian Division, would seize the town and the port. Second, destroy the port facilities, the bridges, and the coastal batteries. Third, capture intelligence, codebooks, and hopefully a 4-rotor Enigma machine. And finally, withdraw on the evening tide, a hit and run on a massive scale. The plan was codenamed Operation Jubilee, and it was built on a series of flawed assumptions that would prove fatal. The plan for Operation Jubilee was a masterpiece of complexity, but it had 4 fatal flaws. Flaw number 1, the myth of surprise. The planners were terrified of alerting the Germans, so in a decision that would haunt the operation, they canceled the preliminary heavy bombardment from battleships. They believed a short, sharp attack by bombers and fighters, as the men were landing, would be enough. They chose surprise over firepower. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Flaw number 2, the tanks. The raid would debut the brand new Churchill tank. It was heavily armored, and planners believed it could easily climb the seawall and smash its way into the town. But the tanks would be landing on a beach, and the intelligence on that beach was tragically wrong. Aerial photos could not tell the difference between sand and the large, smooth pebbles that made up Dieppe's shore. These pebbles, called chert, would act like ball bearings under the tank tracks, offering no grip. The 38-ton war machines would be stranded at the water's edge. Flaw number 3, the German defenses. Allied intelligence believed Dieppe was lightly defended. They were wrong. The Germans had fortified the cliffs, embedding concrete bunkers and machine gun nests into the high ground on either side of the main beach. They had turned the elegant seaside hotels into miniature fortresses, their windows filled with sandbags and machine guns. They had pre-sighted every inch of that beach for their mortars and artillery. The main beach was not a gateway. It was a kill box. Flaw number 4, the command ship. The admiral and general in charge, John Hughes Hallett and John Hamilton Roberts, would command the battle from a destroyer offshore, codenamed Calpe. They would be blind, relying entirely on radio messages from the beaches, messages that, in the chaos of battle, would become confused, desperate, and fatally misleading. These 4 flaws were about to collide with 6,000 men. The raid began at 4:50 a.m., August 19th, the flanking attacks. On the eastern flank, Blue Beach, the No. 3 commandos ran into pure bad luck. They sailed directly into a small German coastal convoy. A chaotic 5-minute firefight erupted in the dark. Surprise was completely lost. The Germans on the cliffs above were now wide awake and waiting. The commandos landed under withering fire and were annihilated. On the western flanks, Orange and Green Beaches, the story was a mix of tragedy and stunning success. At Orange Beach, the men were landed on the wrong side of a river and had to be evacuated. But at Green Beach, Lord Lovett and the No. 4 commandos, including 50 elite U.S. Army Rangers, the first Americans to see land combat in Europe, were flawless. They landed, stormed the cliffs, and destroyed the Hesse coastal battery in a textbook assault. It was the only true success of the entire day. But at 5:20 a.m., the main event began. The 2nd Canadian Division hit the main beaches in front of Dieppe. It was the disaster from the first second. The supporting bombers were late. The landing craft were hit by artillery on their way in. The men who made it ashore were met with a storm of steel from the cliffs, the hotels, and the seawall. Major C.E. Page, a medical officer, later reported, "The water was a mass of dead and dying men. The noise was shattering. I was wading in water that was red. It was impossible to distinguish the living from the dead." Then the tanks of the Calgary Regiment landed, and the pebble problem became real. Of the 29 tanks that attempted to land, 27 made it to the beach. Not a single one made it into the town. They were trapped, spinning their tracks, unable to climb the chert or the seawall. The tank crews, realizing their vehicles were now just immobile pillboxes, did the only thing they could. They sat there, firing their guns to support the infantry until they were destroyed one by one. Aboard the command ship, General Roberts was blind. The smoke and chaos on the beach were total. He received a few garbled messages that some troops had made it into the town. This was a fatal misunderstanding. Based on this sliver of false hope, he made the worst possible decision. At 7 a.m., he sent in his reserves. The men of the Les Fusiliers Mont-Royal were sent straight into the meat grinder. They were landing on a beach that was no longer a beach. It was a junkyard of burning tanks and piled bodies. Their commanding officer, seeing the futility, tried to wave them off, but he was cut down. This was no longer a raid. It was a suicide mission. At 11 a.m., the order was finally given: evacuate. This triggered the final, most heroic and most costly act of the day. Landing craft returned to the beaches under fire to pull off their survivors. Sailors and soldiers died together trying to save their comrades from the shore. By 2 p.m., it was over. The last boats had left. The beaches of Dieppe were silent, save for the crackle of fire and the cries of the wounded. The numbers are staggering. Of 4,963 Canadians who embarked, 3,367 became casualties, 916 were killed, 1,946 were taken prisoner. The Royal Navy lost a destroyer and 33 landing craft. The RAF lost 106 aircraft in the massive air battle, their worst single-day loss of the war. Dieppe was, by every immediate measure, an unmitigated catastrophe. It was a propaganda gift to the Germans. it was a crushing blow to Canadian morale. And in London, as the survivors' reports came in, the planners were horrified. The raid and force concept was dead. The Atlantic Wall was not a myth. It was a fortress. The cost of liberating Europe had just been written in blood. But as the planners, led by Mountbatten, began to analyze why it had failed so badly, they began to see something else. They were not just reports of a failure. They were a blueprint for a victory. The failure at Dieppe provided 4 crucial, non-negotiable lessons that would directly shape the D-Day landings. Lesson 1. Never attack a fortified port. This was the big one. Dieppe proved that trying to capture a port with its narrow streets and fortified defenses was suicide. The D-Day planners abandoned this idea completely. Instead, they would land on open, defended beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. But how do you supply an army without a port? They asked. The Dieppe report gave them the answer. If you can't capture a port, you must bring your own. This idea, born from the failure at Dieppe, led directly to one of the greatest engineering feats of the war, the Mulberry Harbours. Massive artificial ports built in England, towed across the Channel, and assembled off the coast of Normandy. Lesson 2. Firepower is everything. The surprise at Dieppe had been a fatal fantasy. The planners for D-Day made firepower their new religion. The D-Day landings would be preceded by the most intense naval and aerial bombardment in human history. Thousands of bombers and hundreds of battleships would pound the German defenses for hours before the first man hit the beach. This was a direct, brutal lesson from Dieppe's undefended shores. Lesson 3. Armor must work. The image of the Churchill tanks spinning uselessly on the pebbles haunted the planners. You must get your armor off the beach. This problem was given to General Percy Hobart. His solution? Hobart's Funnies. He created an entire division of specialized tanks. The Dragon was a flame-throwing tank to destroy bunkers. The Crab was a flail tank to clear minefields. The Bobbin tank laid its own carpet of canvas on soft sand to create a road. The AVRE was an engineered tank that could lay its own bridge over a seawall. Every single one of these was designed to solve a problem encountered at Dieppe. Lesson 4. You must know the beach. Aerial photos were not enough. After Dieppe, the Allies created a new secret unit, the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, or COPS. These were frogmen, commandos who would swim to the Normandy beaches in the dead of night months before the invasion. They drilled into the sand, collected soil samples, and mapped every single German obstacle. On D-Day, the Allies knew the exact composition of the ground their tanks would be driving on. On June 6, 1944, the 3rd Canadian Division landed on Juneau Beach. They had their specialized armor. They had their overwhelming naval bombardment. They were landing on an open beach whose sand had been secretly tested, and they advanced further inland than any other Allied unit on D-Day. They were finishing the job that the 2nd Canadian Division had started. Lord Mountbatten, the man who planned Dieppe, said years later, "For every man who died at Dieppe, 10 were saved on D-Day." Was it a price worth paying? That is not for us to say. It was a price that was paid. The 916 Canadians who died at Dieppe did not die for a few acres of a French town. They died for the intelligence, for the bloody, undeniable lessons that made the liberation of Europe possible. Dieppe was not a battle for a port. It was the fatal rehearsal, the dress rehearsal for the final act of the war. It was the failure that victory was built upon. Dieppe was a lesson in failure. But what other failure in World War II do you think was secretly a victory? And what other battle site should we explore next? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to explore more of these incredible stories, be sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon. Thanks for watching.